Thank you for joining us late in the day if you're on the East Coast like the four of us are, or maybe a little bit earlier if you're not. I'm looking at the wrong screen, so I have no idea what I'm trying to say. This is a roundtable that is sponsored by the WAC graduate student organization. So that's why we're here and why we're doing double presentations. At least quite a few of us are. So we're going to just begin sort of by introducing ourselves with some opening introductory commentary. And then we thought that we would have sort of a larger group conversation about some questions. So we have put in the Whova interface a handout that has those questions, and when we get to that section I will also put a link to a Google Doc in the Zoom chat so that you can open that and access them. We're not going to screen share anything. So before we get to the intros, I just wanted to share a little insight into our session title, which is Detangling the Professional Development of gWPAs in WAC. And so this title draws on the notion of entanglements that I first learned about a couple of years ago when I went to the Dartmouth summer seminar. And then I, like you start using a word and you never bothered to define it until like 30 minutes before you have to talk about it. So a quick Google search tells me that entanglements can be formally defined as a complicated or compromising relationship or situation. And I tend to think of these as like knots that can kink something up or sort of work you into a tizzy from my knitting. And so entanglements really exist for everyone in any kind of interpersonal relationship, but they seem to be like a really apt frame for thinking about how graduate students develop, how they are mentored, and how they grow. And so what we thought we'd be able to do here is just share some of our own personal experience and then make space for both graduate students and other WAC scholars and professionals who come to think about and talk about how grad students have been and could be mentored into WAC. So we will begin with just those intro comments and then we'll have some conversation. So I'm Caitlin Martin, and in just a couple of days, I'll be an assistant professor of composition at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in Daytona Beach. But when we proposed this panel, I was a PhD candidate at Miami University and a graduate assistant director of writing across the curriculum in the House Center for Writing Excellence. And so in those positions, I both facilitated faculty development programs through our WAC program and studied the ways that writing related faculty development can contribute to conceptual and institutional change about writing. And it's this multiple layering of WAC roles and identities that for me relates to one of the sort of more important entanglements to tease out that I think a lot of graduate writing program administrators might encounter. And that's sort of the overlapping and shifting relationship between me as a grad student and my dissertation advisor, who also was my primary WAC mentor, who also, really worked to treat each of the grad students in her WAC program as a colleague. I worked with Elizabeth Wardle. She not only advised my dissertation, but I was also on a team of people who led and researched WAC at our school. And this led me to a sort of a complication when I was trying to figure out my dissertation, because like most WAC people, I thought, I am going to research what's going on at my school, right? Like that's sort of always our first go-to. We're going to research our own programs. And so I thought I would research the Faculty Writing Fellows program. But that is complicated because, my advisor, who might be critiqued in this dissertation project, is also the person who developed the program. And B, I was also engaged in some other research on the Faculty Fellows program with our team of WAC scholars that often, as I think Mandy can attest to, veered eerily close to what my dissertation was trying to do or what I wanted it to do. And so Liz and I ultimately decided to not disentangle this entanglement, but to like step around it. And so rather than making the HCWE's faculty programming part of my research, I've been instead sort of pursuing two disconnected but very related projects. One is the book project that we just got our contract for yesterday. So Mandy, another grad student, Angela Glotfelter, Liz, and our associate director, Ann Updike, have been doing research on that program. And then I also conducted a multi-institutional study for my DIS, where I did a survey on WAC leaders. And then I went and did case research at 3 other institutions that were not my own. And so as a result of this, I ended up gaining additional mentorship and also developing a fairly different lens for doing WAC scholarship, because I was not looking at my own program, which is something that is not typically done. And so I feel like I have sort of wandered from the script that I wrote myself as par for the course. So I will be quiet now, and I will ask Jacie to introduce herself.
Gotta unmute myself. Hi, everyone. My name's Jacie. South of Nashville. And I served as program assistant for our general education English program for about 3 years until I entered the dissertation phase, because they like to phase people in for some continuity. And one of my challenges is we don't actually have a WAC program at my school. So being a WAC scholar makes it a little more difficult. So I've kind of been lucky enough to actually tangle myself with some people, and had some great faculty mentors who, although we don't have anyone in our department that specializes in WAC, that they're very, very great people that seem to know everything, and helped me get into the field. And after that, took a lot of independent research and learning a lot at conferences, and then in doing my own research for my dissertation, which is a WAC project. And like you were saying, Caitlin, it is hard, like studying your own school. Mine's it's more of a campus-wide survey, so I'm not just looking at our department, but everybody, essentially. I'm still in the early phases, but I call it non-major writing that matters, because it sounds catchy. And it's really about the way that writing students do in their undergraduate careers outside their major, maybe even in something they're getting a minor in, how that exposure to a different type of discourse and a different disciplinary rhetoric, how those experiences can help foster that sort of meta-awareness about genre and about how disciplines work. I like to think of it as writing with a capital W, as opposed to writing as a particular discourse in, say, chemistry or English. And it's a 2-part study, so I'm gonna have a Qualtrics survey design, which will go to all seniors on campus, or those planning to graduate within the year. Arm of it, which will be interviews with seniors, and I tried to view the academic writing at a university sort of on a spectrum, with sort of the sciences, things like that, sort of on one side, with the humanities sort of on the other, to generalize. So I chose English as a very writing heavy field, and it would be easy for me to work in because that's my department. And sort of as a foil for that, chemistry. We have a big chemistry program at MTSU, and plus I find it interesting. I went to college thinking I was going to be a biochemist, but fell in love with English. And then it depends on participation, how many people I get. But hopefully 10 seniors from chemistry and 10 from English, and ask them the same interview questions about those experiences that they've had writing as I sort of stole that term from someone else, but it really stuck with me, and comparing those. which is a long-winded way of describing my dissertation. Sorry, that's maybe too much information. But when I see those, it's kind of hilarious that the first thing we have to do to talk about entanglement is disentangle the term entanglement. But I try to think about, I think first about the positives, because my entanglements, well, sometimes things get complicated because one of my main mentors is my dissertation director. The other person is, the other two people on my committee are also some of my main mentors. So that can be tough, but not as much as maybe yours was, Caitlin, because where mine's sort of focused on the university as a whole. But then too, I think one entanglement is that you just don't want to let those people down. That's one thing for me that makes things difficult. But I guess that's good. It's a good motivating factor. But really, my entanglements have been essential for me in a good way, I think, because, like I said, being a WAC scholar where there's no WAC program or anything, really that's helped me have connections, those entanglements, those mentorship connections, find this new approach, research agenda at all. Before I came to MTSU, I'd actually never didn't know hardly anything about RecConf as a field, because it just didn't have a presence at the place where I got my master's, East Tennessee State University. And when I was at UVA in my undergrad, like, I didn't know, that wasn't my focus back then. I was just a college kid. But I like to think of those positives, and then the entanglements that we have, like this, we're sort of entangled now in a way. And the ones we have at conferences, and through organizations like, I'm the vice president of WPA affiliate, WPA Mid-South, and I've made some great connections there. Those affiliates are really wonderful because you get to know the WPAs in your region, and they get to know each other through being a part of that. And it's also fun because they're the ones that, but yeah, to me, that's what I think of when I think of entanglement. Obviously there are those knots and problems, and I definitely have plenty of those myself. But overall, I think there's that flip side to it, which is really cool. So that's about it.
Thank you. Mandy, I think you're up next.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Mandy Olejnik. I'm a rising fourth-year PhD candidate in Comp Rad at Miami, where I was with Caitlin since my master's. We've been entangled together for 6 or more years, and more to come. But I also work as a graduate assistant director in our WAC program. And this question of entanglement is an interesting and important one to me, because I think a lot about entanglement for me in terms of my identity as a scholar, as an administrator, as a researcher. And so to get started, so my dissertation project centers on graduate student writing support, considering the role that WAC programming can play in helping faculty conceptualize and understand how graduate students learn to write, and how we can reimagine systems of graduate writing to better align with that learning. And so it's about WAC. And you might guess I'm sitting here in our WAC program actually doing such work. And so in some ways, my project both informs and was influenced by the WAC program that we were doing at our center, which has been an ongoing effort. And so in that way, there's an entanglement. And I often find myself wondering, which came first? Was it this research idea that I had? Was it the programming that we're doing? And it often leads to also a certain amount of questions opposed to the research that you do. I think Caitlin's point is really important, is that as WPAs, as WAC scholars, we're always told, research your programs, don't just do service or do teaching, like research it, make it a project, make it count. But those dynamics shift when you're a graduate student, because clearly you're not the sole person doing it, you're not responsible for it. And like Caitlin was saying, if you're researching a WAC program or your director is, being critiqued by it, and if it also happens to be your supervisor, Liz is my advisor as well, there's all these different complicated variables in there. But I also think that there's some more practical entanglements in terms of research data and ownership. So for example, I did this big study my first year where I wanted to survey all these graduate students and faculty in our campus about how they write as graduate students, how they support writing in their graduate programs. Had a bunch of data. We were like, wow, this is really cool. We're going to use it to inform some programming. We did some programming. We have IRBs out. We're doing that. Who owns that data? I conducted that data as a WAC program, staff, and my advisor signed off, but I submitted it myself as a doctoral researcher, and I'm using it in my own project. And so we've had to have some real questions where it's like, oh, this is from Mandy's data, and we have to say, wait a minute, is it really Mandy's data? It's about our programming. Like, I collected it as the staff member, and I'm going to be using it in my dissertation, but does it still belong to the program? Can other people tap on that, either obviously to inform program? What if they wanted to publish something? We just finished a book contract, like Caitlin said. We did this big, overhaul about faculty fellows. What if one day we want to write something more about our programming in general? Can they tap that? Who should tap into that? Should it be with the permission of the person who is there? Should it be the person who is there can contribute? There's all these questions that crop up when considering research and data and identity, that I think I can only really think of it as an entanglement, where it's, it is like, where does one begin and one end? It's all sort of cohesive in that way. And I've been feeling that the past couple of years, especially as I've switched to dissertating and thinking about projects there. And I don't think that I like Jacie's turn to not thinking about it as something that's bad, but like, what does it afford you to do? I think this really lets us think carefully about the role that graduate students can play in our WAC Center too, and how they can bring their interests into the programming and how program can be fueled by their interests. But we do have to really think about what that means and how to support the doctoral researcher, and also how to support the WAC program and the WAC staff, and how to go through all of that. And so I know we have a lot of different questions that we're going to be hopefully talking about, but that was just one sort of entanglement that I thought we could discuss. I look forward to that, but I think now it's up to Tom. Introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Tom. No, that was great, Mandy. Actually, I was thinking, and Jacie, this is kind of your, like, I don't know why I was thinking of, like, gym class, like you have to climb that vertical rope, and it's like, you can't do it without those knots, so kind of like thinking about the affordances, and there's sort of other ways in which knotted rope really does help us kind of make that progress that, yeah, I don't know. That was my side tangent. Anyway, I have my little script, so I'm going to read it and then kind of get to the questions. I think back in 2019, when we were first kind of proposing this panel, I had a real sort of set of issues that I was trying to think through. I had at that time just begun serving as the acting director of Mason's WAC program, which I continued to perform. And at that time, it was, a real challenge for me to sort of reconcile the role of being a leader of writing on my campus, right, and also being sort of a student on that same campus. And navigating just those two roles really put me in some really challenging, tricky situations where, one day I'm leading a cross-campus initiative, and then the next day I'm getting examined by some of the same people I'm collaborating with. Sometimes I've had to tell writing buddies that I would hire someone else over them. And I've even had, a situation where I had to fire a classmate, right? So those are not particularly fun situations, but a lot has happened since then. And really, I hope I haven't gotten numb to those, but I've kind of moved on, I think, to something that I felt more acutely this summer, is really thinking about the entanglement between sort of my professional and my home life. And I think I felt that a lot more, particularly during the pandemic, right, as we kind of live where we work and work where we live. And it's hard to sort of make that division between those two things. But for those of you who don't know, I'm not just this sort of WAC director and part-time graduate student. I'm also a husband and father of 3, right? So this summer I've been on intermittent leave after my wife and I welcomed our 3rd child. And this summer I've also been trying to work on my dissertation, right? And I've really been struggling to collect data, right? So it's really felt like a summer of jostling between different roles, right? Trying to keep the program running, trying to get my research going and moving in the first place, and really trying to keep my family healthy. And I think, I don't know, I think maybe Mandy, you might have posted something about this. It's something I felt a lot this week in particular, like jostling between conferencing, working, researching, familying, Is that a word? And just kind of the sort of, as we were talking before, Caitlin, like the exhaustion of those movements, right? And kind of working between those positions. Anyway, after several months of really planning that data collection and coordinating with the people I needed to really help me collect that data, and then some more months of actually trying to collect it and failing, right? I know it's kind of typical of qualitative work. I finally made kind of a breakthrough, and I was able to connect with participants. So I was really excited. I was like, yes, this is finally going to happen. But it happened at the same time I'm scheduled to be on leave and not really be working, right? Spending more time with my family. So it really comes down to kind of a decision, right? Do I decide to do I decide to put the opportunity off, take the leave, right? Thinking that it might delay graduation, delay any, sort of opportunities to work on that data and publish it, and really worrying that I might not have that opportunity to actually collect that data again. Or do I kind of just go ahead and capitalize on that opportunity, take it while it's there and just collect the data, hoping really that it'll open up more time later to spend with my family. And so I don't know, that might seem like a small choice, it might seem like a big choice, but it was one I really did struggle with in that moment. And I really thought of it as like not unlike a lot of choices that we have to make really on a daily basis, right? Throughout our careers, and that includes graduate school, right? Do I take this particular meeting? If I take the meeting and I'm asked to do something or become part of some new project, what do I say? Do I say yes? If I say yes to that project, how long do I say yes for? And what are the other things that I'm saying no to, and sort of on and on. So I guess what that really kind of leads me to ask, or sort of want to talk about, is really how do we help sort of graduate students, how do we help each other really think about and make these decisions and really kind of make them in healthy ways, so that we have sort of a vision, not just of ourselves as researchers and professionals, but as people, right? So it's not just decisions about our 8 hours, but our 24 hours, right? And preventing really those 8 hours from becoming 10, 12, 14 or more. And I think also a part of that question is not how do we talk about that on sort of an individual basis, but also thinking about it sort of on a collective or more of a systematic basis, right? So it's not just seen as like a challenge that one person encounters, but that we all really do, and that there are really structures that I think kind of make these decisions perhaps more challenging than they are, and might maybe facilitate some of them. So I guess really the bigger question is, right, how do we really establish healthy expectations and standards around productivity and labor, particularly for graduate students? And how maybe can graduate programs, Mandy, this might be a good question for you, model and really structure those expectations? I think that's where I'll stop.
Thank you. So now you all have heard from us. And I just put in the link, or in the chat, a link to a Google Doc version of our handout with some questions we thought we could all discuss as a group, or you can take us in any other direction you want to go. I have a lot of thoughts after hearing Tom talk, but I don't want to dominate the conversation either.
Why don't you kick us off?
Okay, I just started to be like, I'd be happy to, and then I was like, that seems to contradict what I just said. But your comment about productivity and labor and how programs can model it reminded me of like the biggest challenge I had right after we went remote because of the pandemic, which is that I lived with a graduate student roommate who had a very different work schedule and work habits than me. And when we could leave the house, we maintained our own schedules and it did not interfere in any way. And then suddenly we were both home all the time. And I would wake up at like 6:30 in the morning and start working like I normally do. And then instead of stopping at 2 or 3, like was habit, I would just keep working all afternoon. And it would be like 11 o'clock and I would be like, oh crap, like I have been writing my dissertation all day. I'm burnt out. I hate this chapter and it's not in a good place. And it was like one of those weird entanglements because it was like, I didn't feel like I could say something to her, like you need to work in your bedroom because it's making me feel like I have to work. But at the same time, right, like when you get like looped in with a group of peers, what their experiences are the only things that you know. And so it's hard to be like, am I not working enough? Something I like Mandy and I have talked about a lot as you move out of coursework, or like how do you balance that? And how do you, as like someone who wants to mentor grad students or a grad faculty member, like how do you make sure that you're helping your students know when to stop working?
And I think that actually really relates to your question, Tom, about like the whole structure of graduate school. Like it's just not set up well for this kind of stuff. I mean, we all know this. It's like there's this constant culture of overwork. And for part of my dis, I've been researching just the history of grad school and how we came to be here. It's not a great story either. I mean, like they were jealous of everybody going over to England and Europe for their PhDs. If they said, we're going to do a PhD program, make it harder and better. So we've inherited this history where it's just not really great. And I think we really need to collectively just pause and stop and say, this isn't the way that we should be doing things. And I think we're getting there. I mean, in this roundtable, we were having conversations that help where we recognize, no, this isn't really a good way to do it. And Caitlin can tell us from her DIS research about change in institutions. It takes a long time for change to really roll out, and it takes more than just a few group of people at the bottom of the pecking order per se to be like, we've had enough of this, right? So I think these are really important questions that it's not even just for graduate students. I mean, faculty feel this press and this crunch too. Like you're always trying to get stuff done. You want to get tenure, you want to get promoted. There just needs to be a point where we collectively decide like to create a new standard. Otherwise, we're going to get trapped in it, really.
Can I tag on to that? I'm thinking about what you just said, Mandy, and also Tom, your very like particular situation of being the acting director. And I'm thinking about conversations in my own or my previous department about like you know, who at what level can run what and what that does for their careers. And so I'm wondering if you, you know, if you are like the first graduate student who was an acting director of the program, or if you know much about that history. And so I'm just thinking that like one of the things that would be necessary for us to sort of like band together as people on lower rungs of things is to really understand like the differences in the workings between our programs. And so I was wondering if you could shed some light on that.
On me, yeah. I'm trying to think when the position was first established. It's always been a tenure track position. And so I'm at George Mason, right? So Chris Tice, Terry Zawacki both served in that role. Michelle LaFrance is who I've kind of stepped in after she stepped down. And they were all tenure track faculty. I think Terry might have had to do some argumentation about making that, but I'm not quite sure on that history. So yes, I am the first person to serve in terms of a graduate assistant role in the actual directing role. But I mean, I was hired as a full-time staff faculty member prior, right? I enrolled as a graduate student after I'd been hired. So it is a little bit different, but it is still challenging, right? At a sort of a research one university where everything is about research, to kind of walk into that room and try and lead, right, cross-campus initiatives, right, faculty senate committees, and not have that PhD, right, and sort of be in a very contingent, right, I'll be interim 3 years, right? I mean, is that really interim? You know, like, so I think establishing that authority is kind of tricky. How does that help to answer and give some context?
Yeah, it does. And now you just have me thinking about like, where in your program do you go for mentorship? Like the having authority in any place is hard enough as WAC people, you know, and then being a graduate student in that role. And so I'm thinking about even just like your research, hopefully there are faculty there that can support that even if they're not in that role.
Yeah. I mean, I have lots of people I can reach out to. I talk with Terry with some frequency. And my supervisor, Shelley Reed, if you're familiar with her work. So she and I meet pretty regularly. So I do get a lot of good mentoring, but it is still like, you know, it's the WAC program and you're the director and you do it. So it is kind of a challenge to run through that. But Yeah, I don't know. I don't have a good answer to that. I think a lot of it is also kind of figuring it out. I mean, and Mason has a lot of good writing faculty, so it's not, yeah, I'm not on an island. It does create other entanglements though, again. So like I run the WAC committee, which is a faculty senate committee. And so part of my job is to recruit members and get them to cycle on and give them jobs and such on that. And one of the members for CHES, which is our humanities and social sciences college, is the director of our PhD program. So it's like, here I'm in a role of authority in relation to him, but in the program, he's an authority, in relation to me. And so it is that sort of strange dynamic again. And Emily, who just kind of dropped in and dropped out, right? She's a graduate student in the program and will be coming to work with me in the fall, right? So I'm her supervisor, and I've supervised other program mates, as you know, I mentioned earlier. So it is a very strange position, and it's not tenable for sure.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Thanks for sharing.
And hopefully,
yeah.
Long term. Sorry, go on.
I was just going to jump in and say I totally experienced some of the same things. Like, I'm not in a position like yours, so that sounds like a lot to handle. But just as program assistant, these people are your friends, they're part of the program with you, but at the same time, as that sort of liaison actors of the program and their vision of what we want to accomplish in our program objectives, having to have those difficult conversations with other people who are students, and but that you also are friends with and hang out with, and enjoy being around, is difficult. But then too, just the notion of the how much we work, and how, like Mandy was saying, how it's just so fundamentally just problematic, just the way it's structured, because we want to work as hard as, yes, way too much, and I've definitely done it, and there have been times where I've just felt burned out a little bit from just agreeing to too many projects and feeling like I'm spinning plates, but then too balancing that with home and school. When I'm at school, it's a little easier, but I still work too much, but I live alone, and my family's 5 hours away in Southwest Virginia. But during the pandemic, it really ramped up because, just right now, I'm sitting here in my room at my parents' house, and they're out there having dinner, and I had to tell them, try to keep it down a little bit during from 6:30 to 7:30. But then too, last day, trying to get work done at the same time and really get started on my dissertation and get that going. Just, it's like those two worlds colliding, and you just feel so divided, like you're just being spread too thin or pulled apart. And it's like, what should I do? Should I, take this meeting or work on this part of my project, do some research and reading, or should I, I kind of have to take care of my grandma, things like that. It's always been difficult, but they give us a certain amount of hours, as part of an assistantship or something, like 20 hours a week or so. But we all know that's not the way it goes. So I definitely feel y'all on that, and think that's such a serious issue that I'm glad that people are working on it, like you all.
You unmuted first, Tim. Go
and
ahead.
That's all.
No, go ahead, please. Yeah, I was just going to say hi to Mike since he popped in.
Hi, Mike. I just wanted to kind of pick up on a thread. I kind of sense like a thread about community being really important in terms of supporting each other. And I think a lot about our core idea about WAC professionalization is like, how do we as grad students professionalize as WAC professionals, especially if you might not even have a WAC program? But I think turning to your peers is a really important thing. But I want to pick on Caitlin, because the one thing that you didn't say in your intro, and I'm maybe stalkishly reading your thing, is like the potential entanglement that can sometimes happen between peers. And I think, and Caitlin and I are working on a different project with this anyway, about how this idea of peer mentoring, I think lore paints grad school as being hyper competitive. And if we have somebody who has the same research interest, the same mentor, the same kind of project, they're going to try to one up each other. That doesn't always have to happen, but there's still a sense of entanglement where you're doing similar things and you're trying to help each other. And so Caitlin, I don't know if you want to pick up and just talk about some potential entanglements that come up from that as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel like you just read the part of my intro that I had written and didn't read because I was running long. But yeah, I mean, I think that this is on, my mind, because Mandy and I are collaborating together on this article on horizontal mentoring, right? Where like two people who are relative equals are mentoring each other. And it can be like such a great benefit in graduate school. Like it's been like tremendous for the two of us to, we took classes together, we like brainstorm ideas together, we work in a shared space, or we did work in a shared space when we were in person. And so like Mandy was also on my like 7 a.m. start time schedule, and it would just be like the two of us kicking around ideas. But then there's also like this flip side where like sort of popular culture and lore about graduate school is like, well, Mandy and Caitlin should hate each other, right? Like we should be like competitive and like vying for attention over the other one. And like, that's just not really an experience that we've ever had. Or I don't think, like, at least not on my end. Mandy might feel differently. But so like some of our best mentoring, I think, though, has come out of this kind of entanglement where like, Liz would come into the House Center and like have a conversation with me about how my project is going. And then Mandy would come out and we would just have this like communal, like sort of in the moment mentoring. But it also can be challenging because like, sometimes when you see someone else being successful, you start to think like, why wasn't I successful at doing that? So like just earlier today, we were in the session on the book series editor section, and they're talking about turning your dissertation into a book. And I had been like writing my dissertation under that idea, right? Like it's going to become a book. These chapters are not going to stand alone. And then by the time I finished that dissertation, it was like, well, if you had had more time to do research and a pandemic hadn't happened and you could actually do follow-up, like maybe it would become a book, but now it's going to get chunked up into like 3 different projects. And one of those will be a book project, but that whole thing is not becoming like a standalone book. And then it's like, Mandy's like, well, I'm also writing my dissertation with the idea that it's going to become a book. And it's part of me is like, like what is it? Like the glowing, like sparkly, shiny eyes of youth. It's going to happen. But it's also kind of like, well, like I've gone through it now. And so maybe like Liz and Mandy are in a better position for it to actually happen for her too. And it's complicated by the fact that like Liz is also new at our institution. And so half of, our time together has been like her learning the institutional constraints around the dissertation as well, which is actually kind of helpful because she can then make things that were weird more explicit to the other faculty so that change will happen.
What about others? Caleb, I wonder, because you're in a doctoral program now as well, I wonder what your thoughts are.
Yeah, it is interesting. I've been thinking, you all have me thinking about entanglements and what all of that means in terms of labor and emotional labor too. I'm just thinking about the pandemic and last summer as well, right? And what all of that or how that shapes, right, the work that that I do in my doctoral program, and even how much I do or how much I choose to take on. And so I think that a big component too in this conversation and in this the reality of entanglements has a lot to do with emotional labor as well. And just thinking about what that means, right? And what does that mean for graduate students and graduate students of color too, right? Who have been experiencing this pandemic in very different ways. And so that's gotten me to, or I'm just thinking a lot about what does that mean for my professional practice as well. A big thing that I've been thinking about is the act of saying no sometimes, right? And what that can do in terms of the labor that I'm taking on, and maybe bringing some balance to that too. So
I came in late, but I sort of still remember very clearly being a grad student, strange as that is. I've forgotten a lot of stuff about being an associate professor, but I can remember grad school really clearly, and I suspect you guys will as well. And it is a case that you learn so much from your colleagues in grad school, and sometimes you get really frustrated by them and you get annoyed with them. But you really learn a lot from them, and sometimes as much as you do, or even more sometimes, from the classes you're taking, because you're constantly bouncing those ideas off and synthesizing. So I hear what you're saying, Caitlin. It makes a lot of sense. There was one thing that you guys said that kind of triggered me a little bit, which was the book thing. We're not English literature folks. We don't have the same kind of pressure to go out there or maybe you guys are. I'm certainly not. But you guys, I don't think we have the same pressure to go out there and publish a book for tenure. Articles often have greater reach, and unless you're doing something open access, like something like the Clearinghouse or something, then books go away after a while, and people don't, they're not selling a lot of copies these days. So there's a part of me that goes, books are overrated as a way of getting your best ideas out there, unless you're doing something where those ideas will stay current and stay in circulation. So I've been really happy with what we did with Clearinghouse for that reason. But I remember back when we were first looking at doing digital books, there was a book crisis and the literature folks were going crazy, and the president of MLA, or chair of MLA, was writing all this stuff about the book crisis, and there was a whole history of this by McPherson, and everybody was writing about it. It just came down to a bunch of departments were requiring 1 or 2 books for tenure, and it was too much. And in a lot of cases, they're asking people who still hadn't figured out all their ideas to write a book. And there's a part of me that goes, you publish a book and then you regret it for the rest of your life, because if you'd just taken 2 or 3 more years to really work those ideas out, you'd have something you'd be super proud of by the time you're 10 or 15 years into your profession. So I'm really torn on the idea of books. As much as I love publishing them, I don't know that I'd ever look at a dissertation as a book in the first place. I might look at it as the beginning of a research agenda that will allow me to do other things with it. So that's my hobby horse that you guys got me. That I heard that and I went, oh, wait. So I don't know what you guys think about that.
Well, I'm actually really glad that you mentioned that, for a lot of different reasons. I had my dissertation advisor ask me that question, do you see your dissertation as a book or a series of articles or what? And I was like, I don't know. I just see it as hopefully done at some point, but I think that question is actually really pertinent at Mason, and it kind of goes to some of the questions that we were asking before around like expectations. Mason, if you're a faculty member in the English department on a tenure line, is a book institution, right? That you do have to publish a book, or you don't stay, right, anymore. So I do think in some ways those expectations do stay. So I am kind of curious to hear about yours and other thoughts maybe about sort of the mix between sort of disciplinary kind of expectations and institutional ones, and how those kind of come together in sort of graduate preparation.
Yeah, I think that I remember when it's kind of going crazy, and they're basically just working their new assistant professors to death. A friend of mine was there. She was working 80, 90 hours a week because they were requiring either a book and 8 or 9 articles or 2 books for tenure. as an assistant professor. And what really, the people who really got harmed by that, besides the people that were putting in those long hours, were the graduates. I think what you need to do is sit down and talk to your chair, talk to your colleagues once you're in if you're in a tenure line position and you're worried about the tenure decision, you talk to your colleagues, you talk to them, and you say something like, what does it take to get tenure here? And if they say it takes a book, well then, right away, you know what you're going to do. You're going to take your dissertation, or you're going to take a related study, or you're going to do the work to get it done. That's great, right? So I would say talk to them and find out what's going on. But in my case, I didn't need a book. I needed it was a ridiculously low number of articles. I think I had 8 or 10 when I went up for promotion. But I had a book that came out that was in progress, and I didn't even want to count. I wanted to use it for being full professor. And so that came out a couple years later, and I used it for going up for full, which was fine. I mean, I never really worried about it. I was a little overconfident, or maybe I was just confident, but whatever. I had enough publications to get it done. So, but I'd say talk to your mentors there. You're going to have a mentor. You're going to have someone you can work with. Talk to your colleagues, but get it in writing from your chair. Or at least in terms of the annual evaluation, say, could you put that down in my annual evaluation so that I have some clear idea what to go with? Because, in case you leave or something like that, I trust you, but I would do something like that.
I'd say also that you can ask when you're in an interview, or maybe in the later stages when you're at a visit, what are the expectations for tenure and promotion here? And most of the folks that I talked to said, however many articles, or it was relatively blurry at a lot of places, but it was never like a book. It has to be a book. And my partner, who was a genius, decided to write his dissertation as a series of articles, which I think is going to serve him really well. And it's been really interesting to watch his thinking and the ways that he's thinking about where he would place those things and where he wants to be in the field in ways that I think are really, really valuable for his trajectory. And it's too late for me, but I just wanted to mention that in case that's useful. It is totally, a potential way to go, and talking to your advisor about it might be useful if you think that's.
I really appreciate this conversation, Mike and Nikki and everybody. And so as part of my dissertation, I actually am researching the history of dissertations. I'm writing about graduate student writing support. And it is so wild to me in the history that it's just always been a monograph just because, literally because we borrowed everything from Europe, and they didn't even write them at first, right? They would just speak lectures and they would record it down. And then it became this way. But there's a really big misalignment between what the dissertation is and what you're expected to do post. So it's like you're just doing it because you have to do it, and then everyone knows, well, you're going to make it into articles, or if you do go the book route because you have to, you're going to be messing around with it to make it like framed differently. And so I think that really begs the question of, why are we doing it this way? How do we change it? And so that's part of what my dissertation was also looking at, is how, as we work with some different graduate programs on my campus, where we're asking them questions like that in our WAC programming, like, why do you do the things that you do? What do you want students to learn? How can you design writing assignments that meaningfully engage with it? And I feel like if we can all, and it's surprising how some of these requirements are not really that bureaucratic. So the comp exam, for instance, at my institution, you just need to have an exam. They don't care what you actually do. The grad school is like, just tell us that they passed an exam. So you can make them sit in a room for 24 hours. You can let them write for 2 weeks. And once faculty learned that, we had the grad dean come in and explain that. They were like, oh, so you're saying that we could actually scaffold this process and like include this and include that. And I just see so much generative potential in WAC in particular to really kind of help faculty think through some of these things. And I think as an institution, as in academia, we can maybe change these structures. They don't have to be this way. And I think it's just not productive in the way that they currently are.
Yeah, and that really hits home to me as I'm working on my dissertation and thinking about what to do after. I think just sort of the nature of what I have planned, where it's like a direct survey with that data from the surveys and then the interview components. But it is one school, so for me, it tracks a little easier to seeing how STEP is really just expanding this to look at other universities. So it's not just to look at one place, even though that's part of the idea. Is like doing it at my university to leave something productive behind, to give something back, I guess. But then too, one thing about my department, I don't know about how your alls are sort of composed more broadly, but writing studies and rec comp is still a pretty small presence in our department. In a lot of ways, we're a part of the English department, and in a lot of ways, we're still largely, I would say, a more traditional literature-focused program. I think we have maybe four right now assistant professors that are that focus specifically in rec comp and writing studies. So that those expectations, they get confusing because they're different expectations. Like we were saying, literature people, you'd be thinking of a book for the most part. At least that's what I've gathered. And then you talk to your friends, and then a lot of my friends are focused in literature too. So that disjunction of what's expected, I think I got lucky sort of in what I chose. Like I wasn't being wise. It's just how it turned out. That the next step with mine is, across institutional study, bringing in multiple universities, probably bring in hopefully, co-authors too. I think that for writing a book, I think that's really important. At least with something like I plan on doing, but having people and connections at different universities to do sort of a broader scale thing. That's the only way I see it being relevant as a book. But yeah, that's sort of the complication of expectations at my university. So there are all these local factors too that you have to consider. And I definitely understand the frustrations with thinking about what's the next step of this besides actually getting it done. And
I've thought a lot about that question, Mandy. It's really interesting to me because, probably like many of you have been, there are various projects that I work on campus, various sets of data that I collect. And like your question about whose data and where does that data go and how does it get used is really interesting to me. So yeah, one of the projects that I'm involved in is working with one of my committee members, kind of looking at sort of our curriculum and getting student experience data about the curriculum. And I was like, well, if we use this data for publication and for assessment purposes, how might I draw on it as I write in my dissertation? And I've just kind of left that data alone because I just didn't honestly feel like dealing with those questions. But the single author thing is also kind of interesting because I've been looking at undergraduate research, and that is primarily seen as single author, right? When the students write their fellowships, but a lot of times they're sort of quietly multi-authored, right? And I won't say like, faculty are probably very hands-on in a lot of those, but there has been a kind of a recent push to seeing more collaboration. And I'm hoping I can get some of those teams involved in my study to see how that does actually change the way in which they approach those projects and what they get out of their learning.
It'd be interesting if they start hiring groups of people, hiring teams. That's kind of one of the issues, and you want to hire a person. We always hire a person. So we want to see what that person can do. And yeah, when I went up for tenure or even before that, they were really kind of puzzled by my co-authoring. I don't know if you guys have that same experience or not.
I've also heard that at some institutions it's you have to even put down the percentage that you wrote for a co-authored piece. I mean, it's you have to really divide it up to make it clear what your part was. In the publication.
I've seen that a lot in the tenure and promotion reviews that I do for other institutions. Constantly, you're seeing this, like, I did 35% of this. It's like, oh, geez.
Definitely another question to ask when you're on the job market, like how they value co-written things. Some research one of my colleagues is doing is looking at students co-writing in engineering classes, and it's, that's a common question sometimes, and especially in science writing classes, like how much did you do, which part did you write, and it's just like it's completely entangled. Like there's no way to disentangle who wrote what as they're co-editing on a Google Doc in the same sections at the same time. And I just find that such a fascinating question, and so interesting that as a field we could still stick to that, knowing what we know about writing and how people compose together. So
that also makes me think about the question of labor too. Like how in what ways is labor valued and how is it valued? So like what of labor gets valued and what gets left out and why, and yeah.
I think sometimes you have to really push back against those norms. The first book we wrote, that I wrote it with Kate Kiefer, and it was pretty much 50-50. But we had done this long study where Jake Hartwigson had been involved with us as a grad student. We put him on as an author of the book, not like with or anything. He was just an author. And then we had an undergrad student who's older, non-traditional, who was a professional writer, and she helped us with the book writing and editing it. So we put her on as an author. Like Kate and I could care less. It was like, this is cool. This is a team that put this together. But there's lots of folks that really worry about, will I get tenure? Will I be promoted? How will people look at this? So it's complicated. Sometimes you feel comfortable pushing against it, and sometimes you just recognize that that's not going to fly.
Rachel, I'm wondering if you would kind of talk or share a little bit in the last couple of minutes that we have on that link that you.
I shared it just because we just went through this process of trying to define what our publication-based theses would look like. And there was a sort of knee-jerk kind of language that went in the first draft that said, you have to be the first author of everything. You can have co-authored publications, but you must be the first author. And when those were shared with the faculty senate, there was a huge outcry from the sciences, right? They're like, you can't do that to us because we have students, there's this one project and these students are co-first authors on it and it has to appear in both of their theses. And so we had a really interesting process of trying to get over some of the people with more traditional notions of the thesis sort of panic that it might not be, it might not be somebody's own work, right? That if everyone's writing it, then how do you determine that a thesis is unique to that one person? And I think the work that we'd done around defining the publication-based thesis helped us to show that even if two people include the same article and they're both co-authors, ultimately you're going to end up with a different thesis because it's written by a different person. It has a different framing. The sort of bookending texts are different. So anyway, that language there might be interesting to some of you if you're thinking about that.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. Any final thoughts? I think we're out of time here.
That's what I was going to say.
Oh, sorry, Caitlin.
I watched it change. I watched the time change and I was like, oh, there it goes. It's 7:30 now.
I just wanted to thank you all for letting me listen in on your conversation. It was really, I work with graduate students exclusively at U of T. And so I don't, I'm not a graduate student and I don't have a background in WAC, but I'm just looking for opportunities to hear more about graduate student writing experiences and work-life balance. And anyway, what you had to say was really inspiring and I really enjoyed listening. So thank you for letting me be here.
Yeah, thank you all very much.
Thank you for
coming. Rachel, I just started at U of T, so I might get in touch with you and check out what you're doing on the main campus.
Oh, I would love that. Sorry, I don't recognize your name, but yeah, please get in touch.
Will do. Thank you all so much. This was really illuminating. Great to see you all.